Hey there, beautiful people. Welcome back to Black Queer Canon, the podcast. I'm Tre'vell Anderson.
And I'm Mikelle Street. We're your hosts with one clear vision in mind: to put some respect on Black LGBTQ characters on screen.
Yes, every single episode, we are crafting our own little canon of Black LGBTQ plus scripted characters across screens. Okay, you're gonna know these characters, trust me. Okay, now we'll also be joined by some of our faves, maybe your faves, to break down some of these characters. We've added a few characters to the canon up to this point. Watch the other episodes so you can catch up. But Mikelle, tell the people who we're talking about this go around.
This week, it's the Baton Rouge medium Lafayette Reynolds from True Blood. He's a short order cook, a drug dealer, and just an all-around entrepreneur that frankly really sort of like captured my attention when I first saw the show. He was everything that I wanted to see in a Black queer character. And I think that had to do with his eccentricities and personalities and what I thought I wanted to be and all those sorts of things. But I also think that it has to do with the fact that it was set in the South. And so I'm curious for you, when you watch the show, how did that hit for you as someone who's also from the South?
There is this I'm gonna call it spooky ooky. But, there's just like, I feel like there's a spirit within this show that conveys exactly what is a particular Southern kind of moving through the world. Like it's more than just the accents. It's more than just, the bless your heart type energy. And with Lafayette in particular, there is this particular kind of way that he moves and carries that feels very like, for lack of a better term, very punk. And I say that affectionately.
Sure,
okay? I can say it. I can say it. Yes, I can.
Wait, so you mentioned the accents. How did you feel about the accents?
Oh, I thought they were horrible. I thought they were your stereotype of a Southern accent, especially Rutina Wesley's character. She just, it just felt like she just dropped off the back of the truck or whatever they say. Like she was in the fields,
right.
Not those fields, but other kinds of fields,
But
doing the work on farms and stuff.
But it was Louisiana, right?
Sure, absolutely.
And if you've been to Louisiana,
yeah,
they can get a little
absolutely
strong, especially because this was also not a big town. This was a small town, so that they were strong is one thing, but I just thought that there was very little consistency across.
Yeah.
Even though they were all from the same town, it was not the same accent in any way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Something else that occurred to me when we were putting together the list is, I think this is the only character that we have in the canon that is a character in a fantasy project. And so I was started thinking about, other points of representation in fantasy of Black queer characters. And, I could come up with a few. But I wanted to see what you thought, if that was important, right? That we see ourselves represented across genre in this way, scripted genre in this way. And what did you think about some of the other points?
Yeah, I mean, I do think I feel like this fantasy world, this like magical realism space, this very Afrofuturistic, imagination of Black queerness is, necessary as well. Like we want characters that are, reflective of human Black queer experience for sure. And also, why not also have a little fun in with the vampires and the spooky ooky of it all. And I also somehow feel like this world of fantasy is also a really ripe genre for Blackness, for queerness, for other, whatever could be deemed other. And so like I'm thinking of what's this we see a lot more, I think, on TV now, superheroes
Mm-hmm.
that are like black and queer, in that type of space. I'm also thinking, because of the kind of healer and medium slice of the Lafayette character,
Right.
how uh uh other black queer characters are often, those spiritual, conduits
Mm.
in a lot
Yeah,
of,
yeah, yeah.
very very magical Negro
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but like make it queer.
Yeah.
And so that also comes to mind.
Yeah, I started thinking about them, and I think you mentioned kind of the whole CW of it all with the
Yes.
superheroes. There's like Black Lightning and
Uh-huh.
all of those kind
Tom
of shows.
Swift, I think I mentioned that one.
Right,
Yeah.
Tom Swift Swift, sorry. And there's also in the superhero realm, there's Fastos from the Eternals, right? When Brian Tyree
Right.
Henry
Yes.
plays Fastos. So there's that character. And then I think more recently, the character that got quite a bit of discourse, which is also in the vampire, world, of course, is Interview with the Vampire.
Yeah.
Which I completely forgot
Yeah.
about until just now.
Uh-huh.
And
Which the girls love, apparently.
we do. I watched I'm actually not gonna get all the way into it, but it's a great show.
Mhm.
The writing is great. It makes for great gifs. When you're a black vampire and you put up a sign that says "No whites allowed, but your lover is white." I think it makes for great memes. But yeah, I think it is a great show.
I've seen like a couple episodes.
Yeah, I saw the first season and I want to go back and watch more, but maybe this is the Southern jumping out. But like, if stuff gets too spooky ooky, I'm like, that's the devil.
Well, yes,
yeah, and so I have to take a little break. So I took a little break, but I'll be back. I'm gonna come back and finish the show. But yeah, speaking of coming back, I think that we should probably take a little break, and when we come back, we'll have writer, podcaster, and kind of everything, Ira Madison III, who's going to talk a little bit more with us about Lafayette Reynolds from True Blood.
Welcome back to Black Queer Canon. Joining us now to talk all things Lafayette Reynolds. You know him, you love him, writer, podcaster, now author, Ira Madison III. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I like the couch setup. It's cute.
Thank you. Ira, do you remember when you first saw True Blood or sort of came in contact with Lafayette? Do you remember?
I mean, it would have definitely been when True Blood premiered. Like I was into vampires. Buffy was my gig. And I loved HBO, obviously. So like, I feel like that show debuted and it was an event.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any particular thoughts around Lafayette specifically once you started watching, or do you remember some of those initial thoughts?
Initially, I was just sort of like, this character is like the most fun in the show. Obviously, he's sassy, a different kind of like gay character than we'd seen on TV before. Just one where he sort of had his own agency,
right?
Late as the seasons went on. At first, he was sort of giving like sassy
best friend, or sidekick.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. But then everybody got into the mess in Super. So.
What about you, Tre'vell? I feel like you watched recently.
Yes, I just, no shade, I just started watching for this project. Okay, because I don't do the dark-sided, projects. We didn't do that. But I had heard of Lafayette. You've heard of this character that's larger than life. Everybody's seen certainly that scene. We know the scene. We'll dive deeper into that in a moment. But yeah, it just I said True Blood. Only blood I know is the blood of Christ.
Right.
Okay, we don't really do that. But in watching it now in this moment, I was like, oh wow, like this character is actually really interesting. There's a number of scenes that stick out to me as being perhaps some of the favorite moments of the entire series.
Right. Yeah. I do want to talk about the AIDS burger scene in a second. But I am curious if there were, maybe it's that scene, maybe there was other scenes that really stuck out to you guys, or even um just particular eccentricities about Lafayette that sort of stuck out to you.
Mm.
Well, one thing that I loved is that apparently Nelsan Ellis was one of the only actors allowed to sort of improv on
Mhm.
set, according to Alan Ball. And so you can see that in the interactions, and I think that sort of makes Lafayette feel a bit more true to life. You're watching the scene, and you're like, did someone write this? But it's like he's coming up with it himself on set and making it more authentic. It reminds me a bit of in the 90s, like Victoria Rowell on Young and the Restless. She played Drusilla Winters. She talked about how she and sort of the Black actors were allowed to just sort of like mold their lines a bit more so they sounded more realistic as Black people.
And I'm sure part of that was also because Lafayette was supposed to be a much smaller character who was
Mm.
killed off pretty early on in the series, but because of obviously the complexity in which Nosan portrayed him, and also just the fact that it became kind of a
Fan favorite.
right, a fan favorite, they ended up extending, which allowed for a variety of other things, including like Tara getting expanded, expanded storylines and stuff like that.
Well, they did Tara dirty. They did Tara dirty on the show. She can just say that.
Well,
Yeah,
maybe we can get back to that at some point.
yeah. I mean, maybe you're not wrong. One of the scenes that stick out to me, I think it's early in the series. But it's when I at least remember finding out that he's a drug. He deals the drugs,
Right.
or he's the procurer of medicines and whatnot. And there's this scene where somebody comes to him for something. He makes the person basically do a little OnlyFans action.
When Jason Stackhouse
Yes.
came for some V, it didn't have no money,
Uh-huh.
and he made him put on that mask.
Mask.
Right.
Uh-huh.
This was pre OnlyFans, right? So like webcam era. He was gonna make him a cam boy and start a whole website and make a bunch of money, which he would make a lot of money.
Well, of high end,
Yeah.
okay. If we should say of high, I just remember watching that, especially as someone who had not watched or was familiar with the character prior to in a real way prior to this, just watching the ways that like he is so self-assured, he's so confident, and you're so connected, so whether it's respected or feared, whatever that line is, that you can get, the sex symbol, the main, sex symbol of the show, of this world, of this city that they live in, to, do this.
Right.
Just for a little piece of drug.
It's interesting because, I don't think of Lafayette as a character who was feared. I think that he was definitely respected in a variety of instances, but I also think more importantly that he had a value, right? Like that was what he was good at, was finding ways of making himself valuable to everyone, whether that was I can procure anything you need in terms of drugs or whatever that was. And so people chose him in partially because they had to, right? Like he was the only one to get, if depending on what you needed, he was going to have it for you. And so, I don't know that I would necessarily say feared, but on the flip side, because I don't think he led with aggression, but if he needed to, it would go there. And actually, even thinking about the magical, supernatural aspect of it all, right, is that like ultimately, even with the Marnie thing, like shit didn't start moving till Lafayette got there, right? Like they were doing these little chants and doing this stuff. Remember when they were trying to resurrect her bird that died or whatever? She's chanting, they're holding hands, nothing is happening. It took, you know what I mean? So there was this like inherent value in Lafayette that he brought to all these instances, which is why people had to respect him, and had to include him in a variety of ways.
Yeah, I do know they also, as the series goes on, everybody gets in on the magic and the powers, and so I think because I loved his relationship with Jesus, um, where it was like a beautiful sort of like relationship between them, which made sense that you would see this lovely sort of gay relationship, this queer relationship in the series, because Alan Ball had already done, what I think one of the best on TV before in 6 Feet Under. And so you have this between them and then the vampire blood sort of awakening Lafayette's powers as a medium. And I think that, then took him to another level as a character where he could be, involved in all of the magic and the drama and help all of them.
You mentioned Jesus, and one of my favorite plot lines kind of things in the show is his relationship with his mother, actually. And mostly because, and maybe, take this how you want to take it, I just felt it was super real that there was obviously on one hand this super close affinity between mother and son, and she clearly loved him, he clearly loved her. But there was also the gay of it all, the
Yeah.
the homophobia of it all. And there's these ways that she, maybe affirms him by calling him Lala, right? Like this quite feminine name. I always found that to be really interesting. And I loved actually the reason that when you said Jesus, it brought this up in my mind because I love that they named his boyfriend Jesus, that she would always say Jesus. And so she would say these lines that were clearly double entendres of, Jesus loves the little faggots or Jesus loves you, but she's talking about Jesus and not Jesus. But you know what I mean? And I just love that kind of interplay that the writers sort of worked into the project. Okay, so we have to talk obviously about the AIDS burger scene, which I feel like is important for so many reasons, right? So I'm gonna ask you guys your thoughts around that scene before I go. So do you wanna go first, Liv?
I mean, like I mentioned, it's iconic. I love it because for me, it shows, there's that kind of gay person, particularly Black gay person that, is that will roll up on you.
Right.
What you say? And will provoke you to, to this particular point and then put hands on you if necessary. And so I love that scene. I just think more of that, bring that back.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Uh-huh.
What did you think, Ira?
I think it's funny, that's like season 1, 2. It's like really sort of introduces you to who Lafayette is,
Yeah. That's what
It's like you said, not a feared person, but a person who like just get shit done when he needs to.
I love the character for all the same reasons I love this specific scene, right? Which is I think the scene encapsulates Lafayette Reynolds as a character perfectly, which is um this combination of the masculine and the feminine, right? I think often we are presented with one or the other, right? So we are presented with either the drag queen or the leather man, right? Like you have this archetype of masculinity or this archetype of femininity, and I think that Lafayette Reynolds of all the characters really is what I would say a quintessential butch queen, which is maybe she has on a lash, maybe she's wearing a little eyeshadow, or she's using her turban like a scarf like his hair. But also when pushed, she will remove her clip-on earring.
Period. Okay.
Right. And fuck you up and then go back and put it back on and go back and, cook the next meal. You know what I mean? And I think that that is it's it's an idea that I kind of been thinking about for years around this idea, particularly around Black gay men, is sometimes I feel like we are forced to remind people. You'll see it in comments, right? Is that like at the end of the day, I'm still a man. You know what I mean? And like there's that aspect of being a butch queen. It's like yes, you can, say these things or you think all of these things, but at the end of the day, these hands work just like yours. And so that's why I have personally always loved Lafayette and that scene. And I think it's also why people um sort of love that scene so much is because unlike for example, like an Omar Little who sort of leads with violence, Lafayette, the violence is only, as a result of being, inordinately provoked, right?
There's certain hospitality
Right.
there, you know?
Yes.
Yeah. Even in the scene where it's, it's because it's like you come into my house, because it's sort of like, Merlot's is his spot as much as it is Sam's, Ain't nobody thinking about Sam. And even at the end of the scene, it was like, tip your waitress.
Yeah. Right. There's always a little
a little
everything.
something.
This is, maybe controversial take. So a controversial question. I'm curious.
Disclaimer.
Well, I'm curious if you would view Uncle Clifford as somewhat of a modern day sort of permutation of Lafayette. I think just around where culture has moved in terms of the conversation around, what sort of gay was at the time and how we thought of queerness at the time and how we think about gender fluidity today. And whether those things are, maybe someone who was dressing like Lafayette in the early 2000s would be more prone to be an Uncle Clifford, today. It's something I've been considering. So I'm just curious to hear you guys' thoughts around that.
Ira.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting because obviously the show doesn't really deal with gender identity, and I see some similarities between them, but I do still feel like, I don't know, maybe that's something Lafayette would have discovered, but Lafayette just seemed more, very different from Uncle Clifford, just in the way of like, I don't know, like, I feel like Lafayette's a little bit more in control, Or Clifford's in control in a way, but, I think still beholden to a lot of, rules that, Lafayette isn't, and I think it's just by the nature of the businesses that they're in.
I hear that.
Yeah.
I do think there is a uh uh there's a world, right, where, someone who is giving Lafayette at one point later in life, goes a little bit further, in terms of whether it's the actual identity or just kind of expressing, other forms of femininity and femness. I do think there's a similarity between both of them though, in that way, but a difference in terms of like Lafayette's gon' use his own hands, and I feel like Uncle Clifford gonna call somebody. Like Uncle Clifford ain't getting down in the dirt with you,
Right.
okay? But she will call up the security guard looking dude, the bald head. I can't
Right.
remember his name, but she got her hitters,
Right.
who will take care of what needs to be taken care of, and that feels like a notable difference between the two.
It's interesting because like sometimes I think I'm like, am I trying to say that they are versions of the same person, or is it more so that they are
I think they would
different?
be. They'd be in the same community, like friend group, but I don't think that they're very different people.
Well, I mean, I think that maybe they serve the same role in culture at different times.
I feel like he's also transgressive now for an audience that knows gender identity and representation. It's also for in a Black show.
Yeah.
And it's more geared towards a Black audience. Lafayette was still geared towards sort of a white audience for True Blood, or more mainstream audience than Key Valley.
I think for my last question, Ira, I'm curious. When Nelsan Ellis passed, I wrote about Lafayette, and something that I was writing about and still think about is the fact that in the series, I believe none of Lafayette's romantic partners are Black, and obviously this is a big discussion point on social, not specifically to True Blood, but across characters. And I'm just curious if anybody has any feelings or thoughts around that. They might be complex, they might be super straightforward, but I'm curious if
I don't even think I realized that until
Yeah.
you brought it up.
I think to be fair, quite a number of them are not actual partners, right? They're John. Right. And so I think, that
She's a working girl.
she is a working girl, right? Making her coin any way she can. So I think, like that app also adds a layer of complexity. I think another layer is she's in the South and not a big city. You know what I mean? And so it's like the number of gay men in general there is likely small. The number of Black gay men, you know what I mean, is even small. So, and it's also not as if she's not attractive. Like, remember she goes to that house party, I think, and is like flirting with the straight guys and, all that stuff. Anyways, I'm curious, Ira, if you had any thoughts.
You're coming from the perspective of these writers too. I think that there's so much set up with Lafayette being sort of the only Black queer person in this sort of community, just the way his character interacts, the way people interact with him. I honestly just don't think the writers were ready to then add another Black queer character to then sort of be like, well, what does this dynamic change? Now, how does this dynamic change when you add someone in, right? I mean, I think Tara's partners were white too.
Yeah.
I think that it's really just sort of the casting and the lack of,
Yeah. I mean,
adding like other Black characters.
Right.
What you just said made me think about the fact that also, like we talked about before, this wasn't even supposed to be a character that was in the show as much as it was in the show, right? And so, they weren't prepared to do the things that they did with Lafayette's character, let alone add, a village of characters.
I think that, and I think there's also just something to be said about, this might be interesting to say, but like, this is a white show.
Very,
and I think when we now have these conversations, right, people get their Twitter fingers going about, Black queer people in love with other Black queer people, whether it's on screen or in real life. I think the fact that this is what I call a white show, and they're not interested in that.
Right.
They're not interested in even reflecting any sort of truth or reality in any real way, because, there's vampires.
Right.
And so it hopefully is never, too much of that same conversation with this character versus perhaps other characters, right, where we can't have that conversation.
Having been on shows in the past where there are Black queer characters, and like the characters that they date are white, I think sort of for white showrunners, it's very they're diversity minded, and it's like in this like liberal way to help, but it's always of thinking like not immediately thinking, like this person have a Black partner, like, and not thinking of what it means. Like they don't know these conversations and ramifications, but it's always interesting because, the white characters tend to usually have white purpose.
Yeah. We talked about this in another episode about the scene between Noah and Wade where Noah's, braiding Wade's hair, right? And it's like, you can that's something that Black people see other Black people do that like a white person wouldn't. And so, a white showrunner or white writer wouldn't know what the conversations that two Black gay men are having in their bedroom, right? Because they don't know, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, I can write about what a Black gay guy and a white gay guy might be saying to each other because I've had that conversation. I don't know if it's the same conversation. So I think that
and the reality is it is the same conversation, but I feel like there are nuances of what else is happening, right? Or other words, right, that might be used, but it is at its core, the relationship at its core. And you can write that, but I think then us as the audience, we can feel, is it authentic or is it not by, the other stuff that is going on. If that scene in particular feels authentic because we've all seen, somebody in the middle of a thigh, braiding hair back.
I honestly just too want to just say that, it's like a lot of people just don't know, I think that one of my first shows I was on, the Black character was the secret was, there was a character on the show where their secret that they had was, that they were gay, they were hiding, and it was through me talking in the writer's room that I was like, well, why is it their secret that that they were actually secretly dating, the villain of the show? They're sort of antiquated.
Well, this is a great point for us to end this here. But Ira, thanks so much for giving us some of your time. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to see you too.
Special thanks again to our guest this week. And be sure to subscribe to this here channel for more. Black Queer Canon is a production of Slayzhon. It is created, hosted, and executive produced by Mikelle Street and Tre'vell Anderson. Chris Rodgers is our associate producer and editor. For more Black Queer Canon, visit us at blackqueercanon.com. You can also follow the show on IG at Slayzhon and subscribe to our Slayzhon YouTube page to watch the video versions of our episodes weekly. Black Queer Canon is supported by Critical Minded, an initiative to invest in cultural critics of color, co-founded by the Nathan Cummings Foundation and the Ford Foundation.